Welcome back to a brand new deep dive. And today we are getting into something that's really, it's pretty wild to think about. We're looking at a founding story that is just steeped in institutional maneuvering.
Yeah, heavily steeped.
Right. Because I want you to ask yourself, what if the global religion, today wasn't actually the result of a grassroots spiritual movement
Yeah.
naturally blossoming across the globe?
Right, like we usually hear.
Exactly. What if it was actually the result of a massive first-century institutional pivot?
It's a huge question, and it really forces us to re-examine the mechanics of how belief systems actually, scale up.
Right.
Because the texts we're pulling from today, they argue that behind a theology, there is this hyper-complex story of economics, political leverage, and even hostile takeovers.
Hostile takeovers in a religious context.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. So, for you listening, we are diving into a highly analytical exploration today. We're unpacking excerpts from texts like Crucifixion is an Instrument of Imperial Roman Control, Pauline Deification, and the Saul of Tarsus saga.
Very dense source material today.
Very dense. But our mission is to look past the sort of Sunday school interpretations, right? We want to investigate the intense social, political, and economic pressure cooker of first-century Judea.
Yeah, pressure cooker is definitely the right word for it.
We're tracing this argument that institutional power fundamentally redefined the original message of the movement's founders.
Yeah.
But before we jump in, I think we need to set some ground rules.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just to set the parameters for our analysis today, the provided texts touch on deeply held sacred traditions, and they offer some highly critical, sometimes controversial historical interpretations.
Right.
So our role here isn't to endorse these viewpoints or, take theological sides. We are just impartially unpacking the author's arguments for you.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. We are looking at the historical mechanics and the structural logic the sources present, basically just mapping out how the authors reconstruct these events.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with the machinery of that first century world. Because to understand the birth of this specific religion, we really have to look at the friction between the two distinct powers that were running Judea at the time.
Right. You have a very specific, very tense power dynamic. You have the local authority, which is the Sanhedrin Council, and then you have the imperial authority, the Roman Empire.
And the dynamic between them is, it's the engine for everything that follows, right?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
So let's look at the Sanhedrin first. They were this supreme council of 71 members, presided over by the high priest, or the Nasi.
Right, so these aren't just everyday people.
No, not at all. They were the priestly aristocrats, the wealthy elders, the Pharisaic scholars. They held supreme judicial, legislative, and religious authority over the Jewish population.
So they weren't just spiritual advisors telling people how to pray.
Right.
They were basically the architects of the entire social and economic order.
Exactly. But operating directly above them, and this is key, is Rome.
Right, the big boss.
Yeah. Judea is an occupied province under Emperor Tiberius, and it's managed locally by Roman prefects, guys like Pontius Pilate.
Who we've all heard of.
Right. And Rome's primary objective in any province was basically just imperial stability.
Keep the peace, right?
Keep the peace, extract taxes, prevent rebellion. The sources actually note that Rome was quite indifferent to local religious diversity.
Really? They didn't hear what people believed.
Not really, no. They did not care about the specifics of Judean theology as long as it didn't disrupt the Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
Okay, so the Sanhedrin is essentially told by Rome, look, run your temple, enforce your religious laws, handle your internal disputes. But if the streets get loud or the taxes stop flowing, we step in.
And when Rome steps in, it's always with legions. It's violent.
Right, so the Sanhedrin has massive motivation to keep the peace. And it's not just about religious purity for them, is it?
No, because their control over the temple, it's an absolute economic powerhouse.
Let's talk about the money.
The economic scale of the temple in the first century, it really cannot be overstated. It was the financial nerve center of the entire region.
Wow.
The Sanhedrin maintained this religious, social, and financial status quo through a highly structured system of commerce. They relied heavily on revenue from mandatory sacrifices, offerings, and the currency exchange system required for pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that economy for a second. Because if you are, say, a Jewish pilgrim arriving for Passover, you can't just use standard Roman coinage to buy a sacrificial lamb or pay the temple tax, right?
Right, because Roman coins have the emperor's face on them.
It's just a big no-no.
Exactly. They're considered idolatrous. So you are required to exchange your foreign or imperial currency for the approved Tyrian shekel.
The Tyrian shekel.
Yes, that was the only acceptable currency for the temple tax. And the money changers operating in the temple courts, who were overseen by the aristocratic priests, they controlled the exchange rate.
So they're taking a cut.
Oh, absolutely. And then once you had the right currency, you had to purchase animals for sacrifice that met these very strict purity standards.
And who determines those standards?
The Sanhedrin's inspectors, of course.
Of course. So it functions like a massive, tightly controlled corporate monopoly.
That is exactly what it is.
The temple is basically the exclusive vendor for holiness. It's like, it is essentially a toll booth on a road to God. And the priestly aristocracy is standing there collecting the tolls.
Which brings us to the exact nature of the disruption we're talking about today.
Right, because if someone messes with that money...
Exactly. If the Sanhedrin controls the toll booth and Rome ensures the overall stability of the region, any threat to that system is going to be met with overwhelming force.
And that threat emerges in the form of the sect of the Nazarenes.
Also known as the Way.
The Way, okay.
Yes, this is the movement spearheaded by figures like John the Baptist, Jesus of Nazareth, and later, James and Stephen.
And the sources we're looking at, they argue that their core message wasn't just like a nice spiritual awakening. It was essentially an economic declaration of war.
Yeah, the authors emphasize the word bypass.
A bypass.
Right. The Nazarenes were teaching inner transformation, personal repentance, and a direct path to God.
Without the temple.
Exactly. When John the Baptist stands in the Jordan River and offers a new exodus and spiritual cleansing through baptism, he is operating entirely outside the temple system.
So he's basically offering a free alternative to a mandatory paid ritual.
That is the crux of the economic threat right there. The movement taught that salvation and closeness to God didn't require purchased sacrifices. It didn't require temple mediation.
The middleman.
Right. And it certainly didn't require financial contributions to the priestly elite.
Man, just imagine the panic in those aristocratic families.
Oh, they were terrified.
I mean, you have this itinerant preacher telling a heavily taxed, economically squeezed population that, hey, those expensive rituals you've been paying for your whole life, they aren't necessary.
It's huge.
This idea of free salvation isn't just theological reform. It's a massive, massive devaluation of the Sanhedrin's entire financial infrastructure.
And it also poses a profound political threat to the Sanhedrin's local authority.
How so?
Well, by emphasizing personal accountability and direct spiritual connection over traditional ancestry and institutional mediation, leaders like Jesus were actively undermining the council's influence over the population.
Right, because if you don't need the priest to talk to God for you, why listen to the priests at all?
Exactly. If the people don't need the priests to mediate their relationship with God, the priests completely lose their leverage.
So it's a populist movement in an occupied land.
Very appealing.
The appeal is totally obvious.
Yeah.
But the Sanhedrin has a major jurisdictional problem here, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Because they recognize this massive economic and political threat, but they don't actually have the legal authority to just, execute the leader of the movement.
Right. Rome holds the monopoly on lethal force.
Okay, so how do they solve that?
Well, this requires the Sanhedrin to engineer what the sources call a judicial convergence. We have to look at the differing legal motivations here.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Under Jewish law, the Sanhedrin's primary charge against a dissenter like Jesus would be blasphemy.
Which is a theological crime.
Exactly. And the standard punishment for blasphemy under Jewish law is stoning.
Stoning, okay?
But stoning is an internal, community-level punishment. If the Sanhedrin publicly stones a highly popular populist leader, they risk sparking a massive riot among his followers.
And we know what happens when there's a riot.
A riot brings the Roman legions, which immediately threatens the Sanhedrin's standing with Rome. They could lose their power entirely.
Right. So stoning is out.
Furthermore, Roman law is completely indifferent to theological disputes.
Pontius Pilate doesn't care.
Pontius Pilate doesn't care if Jesus is bypassing the temple sacrificial system. He doesn't care about blasphemy.
Right, because that doesn't affect Rome's bottom line.
Exactly. Rome punishes rebellion, sedition, and threats to imperial stability.
So let me get this straight. If the Sanhedrin wants Jesus eliminated without triggering a local uprising, they need Rome to do the dirty work.
Precisely.
But Rome only uses crucifixion for state-level threats. Like, crucifixion isn't just a method of execution. It is a highly visible, state-sponsored tool of imperial terror.
That's a great way to put it. It's a billboard that says, do not challenge the empire.
Right. So how do they bridge that gap?
To get a religious reformer on a Roman cross, the sources argue that the religious establishment had to orchestrate a treason narrative.
A treason narrative.
Yes, the text explicitly characterizes this as a clever cut-and-paste job.
Wow. Cut and paste.
Yeah, they had to reframe Jesus' spiritual teachings, about a kingdom of God as a literal political threat to the emperor's domain.
So they go to Pilate and say, hey, this guy is claiming to be a literal king.
Exactly. They presented him to Pilate not as a religious dissenter, but as an insurgent aiming to destabilize the province.
The strategic maneuvering there is just staggering. I mean, the Sanhedrin essentially weaponized Rome's obsession with political stability to eliminate an economic rival.
It was a very temporary alignment of interests.
Right.
The Sanhedrin removed an ideological and financial disruption to their toll booth, and Rome eliminated a perceived populist insurgent.
Win-win for the institution.
On paper, yes.
But the strategy fails, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you use the ultimate tool of imperial terror to publicly execute the leader, the logical expectation is that the movement just shatters and fades away in fear.
That's what usually happens.
But instead, according to the text, the movement fractures, it decentralizes, and it actually grows.
It backfired entirely.
Yeah, the execution scattered the followers, and the ideas just spread faster.
So political maneuvering and proxy executions through Rome were no longer sufficient. The Sanhedrin had to escalate.
What's the next step then?
The embers were spreading, right, and they needed an internal, highly mobile enforcement mechanism to stomp them out. This marks a major shift from ideological debate to direct physical suppression.
Which introduces Saul of Tarsus.
Exactly. The sources position Saul's entry into the narrative right alongside the execution of Stephen.
Stephen, who is characterized as Christianity's first martyr.
Right. Stephen's prosecution is the turning point where the Sanhedrin actively authorizes lethal physical suppression of the Nazarenes.
And Saul isn't just like a zealous citizen who caught wind of an angry mob.
No. Let's look at his background because it dictates everything he does later.
Okay.
He is an elite Pharisee. He was trained by Gamaliel, who was one of the most esteemed legal and theological minds in first-century Judaism.
So he's not just a thug. He's a highly educated insider.
His education is paramount here. Saul had an elite understanding of Jewish law. He knew exactly which theological tripwires the followers of the way were crossing.
Right.
He wasn't acting on rogue anger, He was an active enforcer, officially sanctioned by the religious establishment.
The sources literally refer to his group as a hit squad.
Yes, they do.
Think about the profile of a guy like this for a second. He is a highly specialized prosecutor, an institutional fixer whose entire career trajectory, his education, his identity, it's all completely interwoven with preserving the Sanhedrin's status quo.
He was the ultimate company man.
Yeah, he is hunting down followers of the way purely to protect the temple's revenue.
And he was very good at it. He was systematically dismantling the movement at its source in Jerusalem.
But then he leaves Jerusalem.
Right. His effectiveness in the capital leads to a massive tactical deployment. The movement had spread north, and Saul was dispatched to Damascus to arrest followers and bring them back.
Okay, this sets up the journey to Damascus. And traditional history tells us that this is where Saul experiences a miraculous vision, right? He's struck blind, and he completely transforms his life.
That's the traditional story.
But the analytical sources we are looking at today suggest something entirely different.
Very different. They labeled this event a strategic fabrication.
A strategic fabrication. Okay, unpack that for us.
The texts ask us to really scrutinize the logistics and the psychology of this journey. First, consider the geography.
Okay, looking at a map.
Jerusalem is the center of mass for the Nazarene movement, and Saul is having tremendous success suppressing them there.
Right.
So why would the leader of an elite enforcement squad abandon his primary target zone to hunt followers in Damascus, which is over 130 miles away?
130 miles on foot or horseback?
Yeah.
That requires an enormous expenditure of resources.
Yeah, exactly. This isn't a weekend trip. It's a multi-week logistical operation across harsh terrain.
And he's not alone.
No, the sources point out he traveled with a large party and wagons to transport prisoners.
So the authors argue that this traditional narrative, that this cold-blooded enforcer, at the absolute pinnacle of his career, backed by the supreme religious authority, would suddenly just abandon his entire life's work during a grueling tactical deployment.
It defies psychological and historical logic, according to these texts.
It's just too convenient.
Exactly. They call it a rewrite of history, a hostile takeover.
Hey, the hostile takeover theory. Walk us through how that supposedly works.
The argument is that Saul realized physical suppression wasn't working.
Because the movement kept growing.
Right. You can't kill an idea just by arresting people. So instead of fighting the movement from the outside, he pivots to control it from the inside.
Wow.
He changes his identity to Paul, which effectively shields him from retaliation by the very people he used to persecute.
Right, I'm not Saul anymore, I'm Paul. I'm on your side now.
Exactly. And he re-enters the movement as an insider.
But wait a minute. If Saul, now Paul, decides to fabricate a conversion to control the movement, why not simply return to Jerusalem, submit to the authority of the existing leaders like James, the brother of Jesus, and just, work his way up the ranks?
That's a great question, because joining the existing leadership doesn't give him control of the narrative. If he submits to James, he has to preach James's version of the faith.
Right.
And James's version is fundamentally at odds with the structure Paul wants to build.
This creates the massive ideological collision that the sources focus on. James versus Paul.
The rival gospels.
The rival gospels.
Yeah.
Let's analyze James first, because as the brother of Jesus, he is the leader of the movement in Jerusalem. How did the sources characterize his leadership?
James is depicted as deeply rooted in Jewish tradition.
Okay.
He views the way not as a new separate religion, but as a reform movement within Judaism.
So he's not trying to break away completely.
No. He is fiercely dedicated to preserving the original literal teachings of Jesus: repentance, spiritual renewal, and most importantly, that free salvation.
Right. He is keeping the bypass open.
Exactly.
No toll booths. Direct access to God.
Now look at Paul's theology in contrast.
Okay.
The sources argue that Paul completely reimagined the faith. He shifted the paradigm from a movement by Jesus to a theology about Jesus.
Well, pause on that. A movement by a teacher versus a theology about a divine figure. That distinction is the hinge for this entire historical theory, isn't it?
It is the absolute core of the argument. By deifying Jesus, Paul fundamentally altered the access point to salvation.
How so?
Well, in James's model, you follow the teachings of the reformer to connect with God directly.
Yeah, I do what Jesus did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in Paul's model, Jesus becomes a divine mediator, and Paul positions himself as the exclusive interpreter of that divine mediator.
Oh, wow. So Paul makes himself the gatekeeper.
He creates a highly structured path where individuals must follow Paul's specific theological framework to achieve salvation.
The irony there is just incredible. The Nazarene movement started as a grassroots rebellion against the Sanhedrin's heavily mediated, expensive toll booth.
Yes.
And Paul, the former enforcer for the Sanhedrin, effectively rebuilds the toll booth.
He replaces the temple's physical rituals with his own rigid ideological structure.
And the texts indicate this was not a quiet evolution, right?
No, not at all. There were direct, intense confrontations between James and Paul. They had radically different visions.
So how does Paul win?
Geography played a massive role in who ultimately won that conflict.
Geography. Right, because James is physically stuck in Jerusalem.
Exactly. He is operating right in the center of the pressure cooker, surrounded by the Sanhedrin.
Which has to be incredibly stressful.
The sources describe his church as being in shambles. They are constantly battling poverty and local persecution.
Persecution that Paul himself had previously organized, ironically.
Exactly. But while James is pinned down in Judea, Paul leverages his Roman citizenship and his elite education to pivot to the Gentile world.
He goes on tour.
Yes. He travels the Roman road system, planting communities all across the empire.
But let's look at the logistics of that expansion for a second.
Yeah.
Because traveling the Roman Empire, writing these lengthy epistles, organizing communities, supporting a retinue that takes massive capital.
It's very expensive.
Right. James, the actual brother of the founder, is running a localized, impoverished church. How does a former enforcer manage to out-resource and out-compete the original followers? Where is the money coming from?
This is where the sources introduce their most controversial structural theory, the Sanhedrin Project.
The Sanhedrin Project.
Yes. The text suggests that Paul's massive expansion wasn't just funded by local donations from his new converts.
Okay.
They argue it was secretly backed and funded by the Sanhedrin Council itself.
Wait. Why would the institution that orchestrated the execution of the founder and hired hit squads to hunt his followers? Why would they suddenly funnel resources to a man spreading a religion about him?
You have to look at it from an institutional risk management perspective.
Okay, I'm listening.
The Sanhedrin tried political execution, the movement grew, they tried violent suppression, the movement spread.
Right, nothing worked.
Exactly. The populist appeal of direct free salvation was a virus they couldn't eradicate, so they changed tactics. If you can't destroy the movement, you restructure it.
You manage it.
Exactly. A decentralized, populist reform movement threatening local economics is incredibly dangerous to them.
Because it hits the wallet.
But a highly structured, hierarchical religion focused on heavenly salvation rather than earthly economic reform.
That is something an institution can work with.
Precisely. The theory is that the Sanhedrin recognized Paul's Pharisaic structural mindset.
They saw he was building a system.
Right. And by indirectly funding his strategic operative work, they facilitated a version of the faith that was compatible with established power.
While simultaneously drowning out the disruptive free salvation message of James.
Yes. The money allowed Paul's version to eclipse James's version.
That is, man, that is a dark theory. But it fits the puzzle pieces together, and the sources even reinterpret Paul's extensive jail time later in his life through this lens, right?
They do.
Because the traditional view is that his imprisonment is proof of his genuine devotion and his suffering for the cause. How does this analytical framework view those years in Roman custody?
The texts reframe his imprisonment as protective custody.
Just of custody.
Yes. They argue it was a calculated measure to shield him from physical harm or assassination by purists, people who viewed him as a fabricator or a traitor to the original movement.
So by keeping him in a secure, state-managed environment like house arrest in Rome, he is safe from the mob.
Exactly. He's got guards outside the door, and more importantly, he has the safety, the time, and the resources to write.
Oh, wow.
It allowed him to continuously direct the spread of his structured religion via his epistles without the constant threat of localized violence.
The idea that the foundational epistles of this global religion were drafted under state-sponsored protection just to manufacture a manageable theology. It is a staggering claim.
It really flips the whole script.
And the sources point to textual anomalies to back this up, don't they? Specifically regarding the very name of the religion.
Yeah, the term Christian is highlighted in the text as a glaring anachronism.
Meaning it doesn't fit the timeline.
Exactly. During the earliest decades of the movement, that word simply did not exist in the vocabulary of the followers.
They called themselves the Way.
Right, they were the Way, or the sect of the Nazarenes.
So how does the terminology shift so cleanly in the historical record, if they didn't even use that word back then?
The authors argue that Paul performed a retroactive cut-and-paste job on the founding documents.
Another cut-and-paste job.
Right. As his theology solidified into an institution, he or his immediate scribes allegedly returned to earlier writings and inserted later thoughts, theological postscripts, and institutional identifiers into the text.
He retroactively branded the movement.
That's the argument.
He builds the hierarchy and then edits the early documents to make it appear as though his specific institutional structure was the divine plan from day one.
It creates a cohesive, unbroken narrative of authority, and it masks the massive ideological chasm between his theology and James's original teachings.
But let's examine this critically for a second.
Of course.
Is it absolutely necessary to view this as a grand, shadowy conspiracy involving Sanhedrin funding and protective custody? I mean, isn't it equally plausible that Paul genuinely believed he had a vision, but because he was trained as an elite Pharisee, his brain simply couldn't process a spiritual movement without building a massive legalistic structure around it?
That's a very fair point.
Maybe he didn't intend a hostile takeover. Maybe he just organized the faith the only way a student of Gamaliel knew how to organize things. And that hyper-organized system just naturally outcompeted James's localized grassroots model because structure scales better than chaos.
That is a crucial historical counterweight to keep in mind. The text we are analyzing applies a highly critical, almost forensic lens to the geopolitical and economic outcomes.
Right.
It argues that the leap from James's Judean reform movement to Paul's global deified structure is just too vast and far too beneficial to the established powers to be merely a byproduct of Paul's personality.
It's too perfect.
Right. The authors look at the money, the logistics of travel, and the sudden shift in theology, and they deduce coordinated intent.
Which makes sense from an analytical standpoint.
But your point highlights the complexity of historical analysis. Separating structural necessity from individual motivation is incredibly difficult, especially when the primary sources were written by the victors.
Right. History is written by the winners. But whether it was a coordinated Sanhedrin project or just the natural evolution of a highly legalistic mind taking the reins, the outcome is identical.
The end result is exactly the same, yes.
Let's synthesize the massive ground we've covered today, because it is a lot.
It is. We began by looking at the friction between the Sanhedrin's economic monopoly, the temple toll booth, and Rome's mandate for imperial stability.
And into that pressure cooker steps the way. John the Baptist and Jesus launch a populist movement offering free salvation, directly threatening the Sanhedrin's revenue and local authority.
Right, and to eliminate that threat without sparking a riot, the religious elite orchestrate a treason narrative. They leverage Rome's fear of sedition to execute a religious reformer on a political cross.
But when the execution scatters the movement instead of killing it, the Sanhedrin authorizes physical suppression. They deploy Saul of Tarsus, an elite, highly trained institutional fixer.
But rather than simply hunting followers in Damascus, Saul pivots. He executes a hostile takeover of the narrative, emerging as Paul.
He outmaneuvers James, the brother of Jesus, entirely. He shifts the movement from a direct path to God into a highly structured theology about a deified Jesus.
Effectively rebuilding the toll booth he was originally hired to protect the temple from.
And the texts argue he accomplished this incredible expansion through the covert funding and protective custody of the institutions that originally opposed the movement, eventually editing the historical record to ensure his version of the faith became the only version.
It really is a masterclass in narrative control.
It's mind-blowing.
The ultimate takeaway here, for anyone listening, is the importance of structural skepticism. When examining the origins of any massive institution, we have to look past the romanticized founding myths. We have to analyze the logistics.
Follow the money.
Exactly. Who had the resources? How was the information distributed? And crucially, whose voices were marginalized or overwritten to achieve a cohesive institutional history?
Because history is a record written by those who survived the ideological collisions. Which leaves us with this final thought for you to ponder.
Let's hear it.
If Paul, history's greatest theological fixer, successfully engineered a massive bypass that completely overwrote the original localized teachings of a first-century reformer, how much of our modern political, cultural, and social reality are we still viewing through his specific, highly engineered lens?
That's a heavy question.
What other foundational truths in our world are simply the result of a brilliant ancient cut-and-paste job?
It demands a reevaluation of everything we accept as historical consensus.
It really does. Something to carefully unpack on your own. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense historical investigation. See you on the next deep dive.